It's a cliche to say that these days it's easier to talk about sex than to talk about death and dying. But the advent of COVID-19 means that a lot of people are going to have to talk about death and dying issues a lot more. It's particularly hard to explain death and dying issues to children. Now, it used to be the case that the first significant death a child or young person was likely to experience would have been when they're teenagers, with the death of a grandparent. And that's changed. People are going to experience death perhaps within their family, perhaps within their friendship network or the school community, or just simply being aware of a lot of talk about death and dying in the media, on the television. Children are going to be so much more aware of it all around them. So how can we help? How can adults help to support them? Firstly, by recognising how children perceive and understand death and dying according to the sort of age and stage they're at. Now, this isn't ever going to be a chronological thing because children's cognitive and emotional maturity develops at different rates, but generally speaking, even quite young babies, a few months old, can demonstrate distress and insecurity when the person who they're the most attached to, usually the mum, but their main carer, if their main carer is away from them, or in the case of the main carer dying, children, even very tiny ones, can show a lot of distress, but of course they can't express it. Toddlers cope with separation because we encourage them to do that. We reassure them that it's temporary. If you think back to what it's like when children start school or start nursery, we encourage them by saying, it's okay, mum's coming back at lunchtime and then you'll be able to have lunch together. You go off and play with whoever and mum's coming back. And of course that doesn't work when somebody's died because the loss, the separation is permanent. Older children, the school starters, the junior school children, may use the words death or dead or dying, but they may not be able to comprehend the permanence of it. They're not entirely able to distinguish between living sensate beings, things that have been alive and are not alive now, and the permanence of death. They interpret messages differently. For example, a little girl who was very fond of her next door neighbour was told that the neighbour had died and that he wouldn't be coming back. And she couldn't relate to that because his fishing gear was still in the hall and she knew that he never went anywhere without his fishing gear, therefore he must be coming back. So depending on the degree of maturity and cognitive development of children, they're only able to understand part of what's going on. As they begin to understand the world around them better, more realistically, in a more mature way, sometimes they want practical explanations around death and dying. What happens to the body when somebody dies? What happens to your teeth when you die? What's cremation? Those sorts of questions. Be as honest as you can manage. If children are looking for practical explanations, then if they don't get that, their imagination often fills things in a way that's much more gruesome and much more frightening for them. Although as adults we try to protect children from what we see as the harshness and unpalatability of death, actually, if they're looking for information, it works better to give them the level of information they can cope with, just in as honest and straightforward way as you can. The two words that crop up very frequently in conversations about death and dying are sleep and sad. Let's do sleep first. As adults, we want to soften the blow for children, don't we, to make it easier for them. And so many times people fall back on the explanation that Grandad got very old and he got very tired and now he's having a long, long sleep, as if somehow it makes it easier to bear than understanding that Grandad has died. And it's an explanation that isn't always helpful, because if children, small children, equate sleep with death or death with sleep, it can be quite a frightening concept. And actually, to use the word died or death is really more helpful and is less likely to cause problems with children being fearful of going to sleep themselves. And what about sad? Sad's only one emotion that barely scratches the surface of profound grief, and it misses completely all the other emotions that children are likely to feel, adults too, to a large extent, but particularly children, who will go through a whole great range of emotions, from tiredness, anger, tummy ache, exhaustion, confusion, denial, or defiance, even in a way of it, in an attempt to sort of impose some kind of control on a situation that they don't like and don't understand. And one of the most significant emotions they may well feel is guilt. Because children can't always make the right links between cause and effect, the issue of guilt is quite a significant one. Children sometimes go through a phase of magical thinking and may link things that they feel they may have done or may have not done with bad things happening. So that if they've been told, please play quietly because Grandma's got a headache, if they didn't play quietly, or if they had done things that they'd been asked not to do, and then at some point Grandma dies, then a child may link that with, I did something naughty, I did something bad, that's what made this thing happen. And one of the things you can do to help support children through that is to offer the reassurance that nothing you did could have caused it to happen. There was nothing you did or could have done to prevent it happening. This is how it is, and it's not your fault. It's actually such a scary thought for a child to think that they've been responsible for something bad happening, that they're unlikely to articulate it. It's helpful if you can put it into the conversation without them asking, and if they hadn't thought that, it'll just go over their heads. If they had had those thoughts, then that may well provide reassurance. That's one of the kindest things you can do for them. Perhaps we can sum up simply in 4 key points. First of all, be as honest and truthful as you can manage, according to the degree of emotional and cognitive maturity of the child. I think it's helpful to use words like died rather than to use words like passed away or gone to the other side, which won't make any sense to young children. The second key point is to try not to fall back on explanations that equate death with sleep, because it can be frightening, and ultimately it's not sleep, and it's more useful for a child to be able to differentiate between sleep and being dead. The third key point is to help children to understand the permanence of death. Children who say, my auntie died, but she'll be coming back because she always comes to us at Christmas, show us that children do find it hard to understand the permanence of death, but it is more helpful in the long run to be able to help them to get to understand that. If your family is a family with a religious faith, by all means use aspects of that to provide comfort, but don't leave out some of the practical information and the fact that we won't see that person again in this life. Death is a permanent thing. And fourthly, offer the reassurance that it was not their fault, nothing that they did could have stopped it happening, and they couldn't have prevented it happening. That's a really important one. And just to be as kind and as comforting and as loving as you can is what gets people through it. There are books available now that you'll probably find helpful. This is one I think is particularly good because it talks about death and dying as part of a natural sequence of events, and it's also a book about acceptance, just acceptance of the way things are. And I think it's comforting, helpful and thought-provoking, and I'm going to read it to you. There's a beginning and an ending for everything that's alive. In between is living. All around us, everywhere, beginnings and endings are going on all the time, with living in between. This is true for all living things, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, even for the tiniest insect. Nothing that's alive goes on living forever. How long it lives depends upon what it is and what happens while it's living. Sometimes living things become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again. But there are times when they're so badly hurt or they're so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. This can happen when they're young or old or anywhere in between. It may be sad, but it is the way of all things, and it's true for everything that's alive, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, even for the tiniest insect. There are lots of living things in our world, and each one has its own special lifetime. Trees that are tall and strong grow slowly, standing in the sunshine and in the rain, and some of them live for a very long time indeed, as long as 100 years or more. That's their lifetime. Rabbits and mice grow up in only a few weeks. Then they go on to live for a year or two, crunching up carrots and nibbling at cheese until they grow old and it's their time to die. That's how it happens to be for rabbits and mice. It's the way they live and it's their lifetime. Flowers and vegetables, planted as seeds at the beginning of spring when the earth is warm, grow quickly to live through the heat of summer. The days pass and they become old during autumn when it's cooler, and then when winter comes and it's cold, they die. It's the way they live. That's their lifetime. Butterflies live as butterflies for only a few weeks. Once they've dried their wings, they flutter and flit from leaf to flower, and at first they're bright and quick, but as time passes they begin to slow down until finally they can go no further. They stop for a while and then they die. That's the way butterflies live, and that's their lifetime. Birds grow up quite quickly too. It's often no more than a few months from the time they hatch until they're strong enough to fly and feed themselves. How long they live after that seems to depend upon their size. Mostly, the bigger they are, the longer they will be alive. That's the way birds live. Some for as long as 50 years, others no more than 2 or 3. But, however long, it's their lifetime for each one. Fish swimming in lakes and rivers or in the sea can be so tiny it's hard to tell that they're there at all, or so big that the only way to describe them is enormous. Again, as far as we know, it seems that the smaller they are, the shorter will be their lifetime, but that's how it is for fish. Their lives can be as little as a day or so, or as long as 80 or 90 years. It's the way they live, and those are their lifetimes. And what about people? Well, like everything else that's alive, people have lifetimes too. They live for about 60 or 70 years, sometimes even longer, doing all the things that people do, like growing up and being grown up. It can happen, though, just as it does with all other living things, that people become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again, but there are times when they're so badly hurt or they're so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. It may be sad, but that's how it is for people. It's the way they live, and it's their lifetime. So, no matter how long they are or how short, lifetimes are really all the same. They have beginnings and endings, and there's living in between. And that's how things are for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for animals, even for the tiniest insects, everywhere.